It's video number 3 of building the Pilot RC FC1 jet. In the first video we got the servos installed, and in the second video we got the thrust pipe and vectoring system all sorted out. So today, that's right, today we're getting the power plant installed. It's the brilliant brand new JetCat P250 PRO V2. But before we can do that and its fuel system, we're going to get on with the landing gear. So let's get straight into it. Starting with the nose wheel, it's nice to see that it comes with the servo plate as standard, so no silly pull wires. And the fuselage itself, the nose section, comes with the cutout already made and even with the holes pre-drilled for the landing gear. So the whole thing just slots in. Now it comes with wood screws, so we'll give them one chance, see how they work. I'll whack in a little bit of cyano into the holes just to try and reinforce the wood a little bit more, and then we'll see how confident we feel once we've finished, whether we leave that or swap them out for nuts and bolts. Sounded too easy to be true, didn't it? Well, it was. The whole unit doesn't quite fit in the slot because, let's see if we can take this out a little bit, you can just make out that there's those 2 slots of wood down there which are right in the way of where the servo plate wants to be when the landing gear is in its retracted position. So, looks like we're going to have to Dremel both of those little bits out so we can get it in. Four snips, a little bit of sanding, and we're looking good to continue with the original plan. And there we have our nose leg fully installed, cyanoed down with its own wood screws. It looks nice and strong at the moment, so we'll be giving it a chance, and then we just need to install our servo onto the servo plate in there, like that. For the steering servo, the plan was to use another one of my lightweight MKS servos. The problem is that it doesn't fit. I probably should have read the manual before ordering the servos, as I would have seen that it uses a mini-sized servo. So, to avoid any further delays, I've gone with one of Pilot's own servos, the PW16AH, which we know fits in here perfectly. Unlike most of the servos in this model, I am going to install the little rubber grommets, because after all, this servo is going to be taking the bashing on steering on every single landing. So if we can just help it absorb a little bit of that, it's probably going to help extend the life and reliability of the servo. You know when things don't quite go your way? Well, it turns out that the Pilot servo doesn't quite fit either, because the motor sticks out the sides ever so slightly. So we're going to have to mark it on the servo plate and Dremel it out a little bit so we can actually push it all the way through. Great. Having Dremeled out both sides of that aluminium, our servo now slots in nicely. All we need to do now is actually put it the right way around, as it's currently upside down, and then screw it all in place. And hopefully no more problems with the steering. That all looks a little something like that. We've used the included push rod. We've gone for a particularly short servo arm to get the most torque out of our servo, to make sure that our steering always works in a very positive manner. Good to go. On to the mains. Regular viewers of the channel will probably recognise that this isn't the kind of landing gear that I would usually install. My preference is always towards electron retracts. At the moment though, they don't have a set for this particular model. That means that even if I were to try and change it, we would still be using the same legs and wheels. So it's kind of only halfway there. So as it did come with the kit, we'll be giving it one chance, we'll be installing it, seeing how she runs, and if for any reason it doesn't gain all of my confidence, it'll be time for a Franken retract. Half electron, half whatever this is. Which should be relatively easy to install. They just have 4 bolts that go through into the former, which comes pre-drilled and already has blind nuts installed behind it. So it's just a case of screwing everything in place, something a bit like that. Probably sounded too easy to be true. It kind of was. So screwing it in went well, no issues there. However, we need to cut a little bit out of the fuzz here because the wheel itself doesn't actually fit. We need to just cut that back just a little bit. No biggie though. So a little sanding and she's good to go. With both retract mechanisms now in place, we would normally proceed with the struts. However, because we still need to install the fuel tank in here and we want to be able to access that easily, I'm going to leave the struts off for now so that they're not right there in the middle of where we want to be, and then we'll continue with those later on. Those of you that watched my unboxing video will likely remember this bottle, or should I say fuel tank, which I wasn't too convinced about initially, and well, not much has changed. So I've spoken with CM Jets and we've got a couple of his fuel tanks here. Now obviously they're not both going in the plane, we're going to have to choose one or the other. How though? Well, what are the differences? Obviously, aside from looking bigger and smaller, this one has an integrated UAT, which means we've got fuel and UAT in one, which, considering I'll likely be swapping this model over to a bag sometime in the future, would be handy because it keeps everything in one, and when I remove the tank, the UAT comes with it. This one though may look bigger, and obviously on face value it is. However, it actually carries the same amount of kerosene. It just has a partition down here for the smoke, which I also want to run smoke. Now of course I could go back to Carlos and say I would like a hybrid version, UAT on this one, and that was my initial thought. However, I'm not too sure about how well this particular clunk will work. After all, normally our fuel line or clunk line runs from roughly the center of the tank, and obviously it comes down, and then when you fly upright the clunk falls one way, and then when you're inverted it falls the other way. Here though, because the clunk line starts so high up, if we're flying upright we have a really long fuel line, but if we're going to fly inverted we need a short fuel line. Now obviously we can't change the length of that in flight, which means we either find a happy medium which isn't going to suck out all the fuel probably when flying upright, or if we leave it as long as is necessary for that, well, when you're flying inverted I'm not too sure what's going to happen to the clunk. So even though I'm sure Carlos has made his own tests with this and people are probably using it already, I like the idea of things that I know and understand, so I'm going to stick with this one, even if that does mean having a separate UAT. Now for the UAT I'm going to be using this one which came with the kit, which is far better quality than I would say the original fuel tank was. When ordering these tanks from CM Jets, what you receive is a tank with all its accessories. So basically it's ready to go. So if we take a look, we open up the lid, bear with me. Oh, hang on, tank's alive. Put that over there. So it comes ready plumbed. We have our Tygon tubing, our copper pipe in the middle to prevent it from bouncing back on itself, everything tied down, and the clunk. Now personally, I'm not a fan of these felt clunks. They're furry and they can let go of some of that fur. If they do that, the fur can make its way up the fuel line towards the pump. Now obviously if it reaches the pump can get stuck and that would be disastrous. So rather than having to install an extra filter before the pump to make sure that doesn't happen, I'm just going to swap it out for one of my usual heavy duty and completely hollow clunks, which obviously can't have that issue. All I'll do is filter my fuel before it reaches the fuel tank so it can never have that problem in the first place. I know this is very much a personal preference kind of thing, and everyone seems to have their own opinion on which kind of clunk and fuel system is better. Personally, I've been using these for years though and never had an issue. Taking another step back though, before we install the tank, we need to install the turbine, because we need to make sure that there's enough clearance between the end of the tank for the beginning of the turbine. So This is the P250 PRO V2. Now, it's the first Pro turbine that I have from JetCat. I've had a few others, but they're all the standard purple version. So what's the difference other than the grey colour and these, well, slightly unusual connectors and different ECU? Well, let's get to installing it and we'll find out as we go along. The first thing we notice is that the turbine mounting bracket doesn't quite fit in the gap. Now that isn't because the turbine's too big, it's simply because of the nuts that are welded on the back of this that clash with the wood mounting beams. So first of all, we need to see whereabouts approximately that needs to go, so we can cut a little bit out of the wood so it can sit flush. And then we can see exactly where it needs to go to mount the turbine centrally for our thrust pipe. So we've put in some masking tape so we can mark it easily where it needs to go. We've made sure that our turbine is sitting exactly where it would be on the mounting bracket. So in my case, these screws around the center of the turbine line up with holes in the mounting bracket itself. And we're making sure that the thrust tube is approximately about 1 inch inside the cone. So we can check that real quick and make sure that that's more or less about 2.5. 2.5. We want to be somewhere around there at 1 inch, so probably bring it just a smidgen back then, just so it's around about that 1 inch, 2.5 centimeter mark. We're now going to mark that and then just cut away a little bit from that wood. And with all of that nicely marked out, I'm going to drill out those 2 holes, same down below, and then Dremel them out a little bit more. After all, we want to make sure that they're not actually locking anything in place. We need plenty of room to be able to wiggle this about as necessary to make sure that the turbine is perfectly straight and centered when we go to drill our main fixing holes. With those now drilled and Dremeled out, we can now easily install our mounting bracket. We can now install our turbine onto it, make sure that everything's straight, centered and pointing where we need it to, and then we can drill out those other 4 holes to actually finally mount everything in place. At the same time, we'll drill out and screw down our pipe. That way everything's exactly centered as we need it to be. First glimpse of what it's going to look like with a turbine in place. Now we just need to make sure everything's centered, mark down those 4 holes, and it's turbine time. The kit comes with this handy piece of wood, which is for engine mounting reinforce. Basically, it's 4 wooden washers, which are just going to sit underneath the engine bearers, so the wood is a little bit thicker there. I'm going to mount my engine using 4mm bolts and these blind nuts, which are going to basically sit into these washers underneath the bearers. Just need to make those holes a little bit bigger. And now that we've drilled those out, if we just pull them through, we're going to get one of our blind nuts. He'll just sit and press into there. When that tightens up, that'll push through and hold our turbine nicely in place. And with our mounting bracket nicely secure, our turbine's ready to go. We just need to install the top plate. However, as we don't want any rubbish getting into our turbine, we're going to be removing it and installing it once the rest of the build is finished. Before doing that though, we are going to just make sure that the front of our starter motor doesn't get in the way of where we plan on installing our fuel tank. So make a few measurements and then we'll be on with the fuel tank again. With the turbine presented, we can see exactly what space we have for our fuel tank, which we can see just about fits inside, even with this wooden mount. So how are we going to mount it? Well, we have these lugs on either side of the fuselage, which are obviously designed to carry Velcro, but that alone doesn't kind of convince me. So as we have some space here, I'm going to cut out the back end of these wooden supports so that the front of the tank can sit flush with this mount. That will prevent the tank from being able to go forwards. I'll then make a similar mount at the back for the same reason, to prevent it from going backwards. I'll make a small kind of cradle for it in the middle so that the weight of the tank isn't sitting on the fuselage when upside down, and then we'll Velcro it in place. Hopefully that will look and feel nice and secure, but we'll see as we go on. That's got the back of the mount taken off, so that now sits nice and flat and flush. We'll just add some foam on there or something so that the tank doesn't rub up against the neat wood. And then I've made out of foam core these little templates which will sit roughly one there, and there's another one there in the back, so the tank can sit on those, act as a cradle, and it'll be nice and secure. So now that we've got these, we need to cut them again out of balsa to keep it nice and light, and we'll secure them in place. And that's those couple of pieces of balsa now cut to shape and glued into the fuzz just with a few drops of cyano. After all, they're not really holding anything, they're just supporting the tank. So not too much glue needed, doesn't need to be too strong, so it can all be kept nice and light. And now the tank should fit nicely like that, and it's now nicely tight. Now we just need to see how to actually secure it in there. On to about version 7 of our fuel tank mounting system. Just using Velcro over the top still didn't feel right. So I've made up and attached these pieces of wood to either side of the fuel tank, and they've been fiberglassed on there, both bottom and top. So the wood is now very much part of the fuel tank. If we slot it into our model, you can see how those two pieces of wood now fit perfectly onto those side mounts in the fuselage. I've made a slot in the middle part where we're still going to run some Velcro over the top, keeping it into those mounts that we made earlier. And then I've drilled these two holes, which will just have a cable tie on each one of them going into that side mount. So basically, it's not going to allow the tank to lift even if the Velcro weren't there. Not only that, but the fact that one hole is at the rearmost point of the slot in the side there, and the other one is at the frontmost point, it will also avoid the tank being able to go forwards or backwards. So we're going to have 4 cable ties and the Velcro over the top. And with that, I'm quite sure that now the tank isn't going to be going anywhere, which it may have taken a few attempts to get here, but I'm finally happy with the outcome. I had intended to finish installing the turbine, the fuel system and the landing gear in this video, leaving just the power box and wiring for the final clip. However, with figuring out how exactly to install the fuel tank, a few modifications along the way, partly as well because this is a very early kit even though I'm building it late, this video is really starting to run on. So rather than have a half-hour video, we're going to leave it here and pick up in the next one where we are going to get all of that finished and it's time to really get this thing ready to be airborne. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, leave us a like, subscribe if you aren't already. Let me know in the comments below of any questions, queries, or even observations of things that maybe I could improve on and do better and fix for the next video. And until then, I'll see you all in the next one.